All right, guys, so we got to talk about Bill Maher once again, right? As I've been talking about him lately, probably like once a week, particularly on the weekends after his show, because he's been giving some takes that have pushed back against the extreme left and their woke nonsense, okay? And I think it's important for classical liberals like him to push back against the extremeness in the Democrat Party. However, this take right here from Bill Maher, I don't necessarily agree with as much as I've agreed with some of his other takes, as this take right here shows exactly why he's still a classical liberal, and I laugh at anybody who wants to throw the label of conservative on Bill Maher, right? Because I don't think that he is conservative or even moderate, right? He's still a liberal, and this take right here that proves that he's still a liberal involves the situation of Ron Rivera of the Washington Commanders, the NFL team formerly known as the Redskins. Apparently, you can't say that, right? And Ron Rivera choosing to fine his defensive coordinator, Jack Del Rio, $100,000 for simply expressing his First Amendment right to free speech when he gave his opinion on January 6th and the fact that people are paying attention to that and talking about that, but we're not talking about the BLM riots that happened during the Summer of Love, right? So with that being said, Bill Maher is going to chime in on this, in which he's going to get it halfway right.
Now, for years, you can hate Trump. You can't hate the people who like him because it's half the country. And I'll give you an example of where I'm probably with you on something this week. There was a football coach. His name is Jack Del Rio, okay? And he called the January 6th riot a dust-up. Now, this is a very common view that he has. I would like to, if I could talk to Mr. Del Rio, I think I could probably, hopefully convince him a little bit that it was more than a dust-up. He also compares it a lot to the 2020 protests that were going on after the George Floyd murder. Okay, I think I could also convince him there are really important differences between those two things. And actually, the attack on the Capitol was worse. Nevertheless, he has a right to be wrong.
Yes.
In America, you have the right to be wrong.
Yeah.
They fined him, the team fined him $100,000 for this opinion. Fining people for an opinion. I am not down with that. And here's what the coach of the team said. This is his, his assistant coach. So his boss said about the guy who got fined, he does have the right to voice his opinion as a citizen of the United States. And it most certainly is his constitutional right to do so. Apparently not. You know what? This is the don't pee on my shoe and tell me it's raining. What the fuck are you talking about? He doesn't have a right to opinion, and it's obviously not his right to do so.
Yeah,
so either say you're against free speech, but don't tell me this.
No, it's absurd. And he should be allowed to express his opinion, and people should be allowed to criticize him for
People
it.
can have shitty takes.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a crime to have a shitty take.
To have a shitty take is not a crime.
I mean, there's a back.
Yeah, so I want to make it clear here, right? Again, this is why Bill Maher is still a classical liberal. And again, I would not categorize him as conservative, but I will say, right, this take right here that he got halfway right is also a reason why he's not a radical leftist. Because a radical leftist would say, no, he does not have the right to freedom of speech, right? He doesn't have the right to freedom of speech. That's what a radical leftist would say. A classical liberal would say, well, he has the right to freedom of speech, but, his opinion is wrong. And this is why I can say, you know what? This is where we can have a debate, right? We can have a reasonable conversation about that because conservatives and classical liberals, true classical liberals, should agree that, the dude has a right to freedom of speech and he should not be fined for what he said, okay? He has the right to say what he say. But his opinion was not wrong, right? And Bill Maher, this is where, as a conservative, I will say that you have the right to your freedom of speech and the right to be wrong. You have the right to your shitty opinion because this is a shitty opinion from you, right? To sit here and say that the January 6th protest, riot, whatever you want to call it, was worse than the BLM protests, riots, whatever you want to call them, that's just objectively wrong, right? By no objective facts or statistics can you sit here and tell me that the January 6th riots were worse than the BLM riots. First and foremost, January 6th was one event, right? It happened on one day in one city, right? In one city. The BLM riots, on the other hand, happened over a whole summer, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Okay? And it happened in cities all across this country. So again, in terms of people impacted, in terms of actual impact, people affected, BLM protests, objectively speaking, are worse, right? Way more people were negatively impacted from that than what happened on January 6th, okay? And then people want to talk about what the intent of the January 6th rioters made it so bad. It made it worse than BLM because the BLM rioters they were fighting for justice, right? That's what they say. And I'm like, no. What you got to understand is that the intent was damn near the same in terms of what two groups of people thought that, hey, we're fighting for justice, right? Now, whether or not you agree with those people and whether or not their causes that they were fighting for was actually justified or whether that what they were doing was right, that's on you. But those two groups of people, BLM and the January 6th protesters, they thought what they was doing was right, okay? Let's keep it 100 here, right? So with that being said, the BLM protesters and rioters actually, in some instances, got what they wanted. For example, when it comes to the CHOP/CHAZ zones, the autonomous zones that were being set up in some of these liberal cities on the West Coast, like Seattle, right? They actually took over a whole precinct. Okay, they started running it themselves. They were actually successful. Had their own community services and government and everything. They ran it for what, a month or two or something like that? The January 6th protesters, on the other hand, they weren't successful, right? They had no shot in actually taking over the government. There was no coup, right? There was no insurrection. No matter how much they want to call it an insurrection means that they actually took over the government. They did not take over the Capitol. At no point did they ever take over the government, right? They did not take over the government. That didn't happen. There was no coup. There's none of that. So again, look at the BLM protesters. They actually were able to overthrow a government authority, right? January 6th protesters were not. Speaking of that, right, because BLM actually overthrew a portion of the government, they actually were successful at that. They staged a successful coup, okay? People lost their lives, right? People died because of those autonomous zones, because police and medical services could not get to people that were being shot and killed in the streets fast enough because of protesters in the street. People died because of that, right? And you want to talk about deaths. Let's compare deaths. During the BLM riots, / Antifa riots as well, too. You got to throw Antifa in there as well. We're talking about what? At least 25, 30 people were killed, right? Depending on which estimates you look at. Now, you look at January 6th, only one person was truly killed during that incident, and that was Ashley Babbitt. That was it. Everybody else that died in relation to that event, I'm not even going to say as a result of it. I'm going to say as in relation to it, it was either suicide or something else. They weren't actually killed by any of the rioters. They weren't actually killed. The only person that was killed was actually killed by a police officer. And that person was a protester herself. So let's take it to another level. Let's keep going further. When you talk about actual property damages, January 6th, again, depending on what estimate you look at here, I'm looking at Forbes, $2.73 million in property damage. $2.73 million. The BLM riots from May 28th to June 8th across 20 states, $1 to $2 billion in damages. It is the most expensive civil unrest in American history. 1 to 2 billion compared to 2 or 3 million at most for the January 6th protest/riots. In fact, I guarantee you, the BLM protest in Washington, D.C. itself was worse than January 6th, right? It cost $18 million just to deploy the National Guard to quell the D.C. protests. Again, that's not even counting property damages. Not even counting it. $18 million just to make it go away, just to make it stop, right? And I haven't even got to the long-term impact of these protests/riots from BLM, right? January 6th is basically done. The lasting impact from January 6th is that, well, you got people that, arguably speaking, probably having their rights violated, okay, that are being locked up without due process for something that really is as petty as just, wandering into the Capitol, right? After they were let in, okay? That's probably the most long-lasting consequences that we have from January 6th, okay? But outside of that, I would argue there's not really much else left to do with January 6th. Okay? BLM protests, though, / riots, our criminal justice system has been corrupted, right? That has created a precedent where these far leftists have become emboldened to say, hey, you know what? We're going to try to intimidate judges, right? We're actively going to try to intimidate judges to try to get the outcomes that we want in trials, right? Whether that be trying to intimidate judges or juries, right? That's what they tried to do during the Derek Chauvin trial. That's what they tried to do during the Kim Potter trial. That's what they tried to do with the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And time again, we've seen these leftists become emboldened by the BLM riot / protest to try to undermine our criminal justice system. That's what they do. That's what they do. So again, that in my opinion, in and of itself, is kind of an insurrection because, again, you're undermining the sovereignty and integrity of our institutions, right? That's what you're doing. But again, people like Bill Maher, for whatever reason, they don't see it that way. They say, well, January 6th is just worse because I didn't agree with the cause or the reasoning behind why these people were protesting, right? But see, he probably agrees with BLM. He agrees that policing is systemically racist and that black men are being indiscriminately killed in the street, right? He agrees with that. And because he agrees with it, they say, well, it's not worse because I agree with why they're doing it. But why they're doing it in both situations, in my opinion, is kind of irrelevant because both sides thought they were fighting for the right thing. So once you take that out of it, and I think we all can agree that the violence in both incidences were not justified, right? That you shouldn't be using violence as a way to achieve political objectives. If you look at just the facts and the standards in regards to who was actually affected, the damage that was done, people killed, and the long-lasting effects, by any of those standards, the BLM riot / protests are just worse. And anybody saying anything different, you're biased, right? You're biased. You're biased. And this is coming from a person who has repeatedly condemned January 6th, right? I've repeatedly come out here and said that was wrong. That was bad. That was probably one of the worst days in Republican Party history. I've repeatedly said that. But compared to the BLM riots and protests, it was dust up. Like Jack Del Rio said, he was 100% correct about that. His opinion was right. And Bill Maher's opinion was wrong. I just wish that I can go on Bill Maher's show and tell him that his opinion is wrong. Because I'm pretty sure I can convince him using facts and evidence that no, BLM / Antifa riots were far worse than what we saw on January 6th. But see, if you acknowledge that, okay, the reality that the BLM / Antifa riots were far worse than January 6th, which they all know in their head that it was. They just don't want to say it because, one, they might be called racist. But the ultimate truth is that, well, we will have to have hearings about why that happened, right? We're going to have it about January 6th. We have to have it about that. And again, this is what separates people that are actually serious about dealing with political violence in this country and people that are not. The people that are not serious about dealing with political violence, they look at the BLM protests and riots and try to say, well, it's justified because, well, I agree with why they did it, right? That's the problem. Because at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not you agree with why they did it, you should always disagree with the violence, right? That the violence is not justified. But again, for whatever reason, the left has such a hard time with that. They have such a hard time with calling the BLM riots out for what it actually was, okay? Which, again, was unjustified political violence. That's what it was. So, hey, I wouldn't take away Bill Maher's right to his shitty opinion. I just wish that I could go on his show and tell him that his opinion is, in fact, shitty, right? You have the shitty opinion in this situation, not Jack Del Rio. Jack Del Rio was spot on. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.